Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art-related topics. My name is Matt, and in today's tutorial we will break down the process of how to draw a tongue. Now, tongues are one of these really strange features that needs some context, and this is because they're quite abstract in their form. Tongues are what you would call a contextualizing feature, and what I mean by this is that it needs surrounding features in order for it to make sense. Tongues would not make sense in isolation, so in order to draw an accurate tongue, what we're going to do is we're going to draw a mouth opening with the tongue sticking out, and this is going to give us a good sense of how the tongue functions and is placed within the context of a mouth. So we can begin this drawing process with a light pencil sketch, and what we're going to do now is we're going to actually start working on a shaping of the mouth. So when a mouth opens, what happens is the top row of teeth are what are most visible, and what happens is those top row of teeth are kind of resting on the tongue. The tongue itself tends to overlap the bottom row of teeth, so the bottom row or the bottom lip as well won't be visible. What will be visible is obviously the tongue itself, and then this widening of the upper lips with the exposed top row of teeth. So with our pencils, what we want to do is we want to work on a light sketch, and this is where we start to just vaguely form the tongue and the shape of the mouth. Again, because the upper lip is kind of stretching, it starts to become slightly thin. We want to remember that the top lip is not large, it is quite a narrow shape, and as it widens it will obviously lift up slightly, exposing the entire top row of teeth. When it comes to the top row of teeth, the teeth that tend to be most visible are the central incisors, as well as the lateral incisors and the first premolars. As soon as we start getting to the back row of teeth, they tend to fall behind the cheeks and become less visible. So we also want to consider how obviously the upper lip not only stretches wide to expose the top row of teeth, but which teeth are exposed. We're also getting a sense of the entire tooth, so that means that we're seeing the gum and the entire tooth of these main front row teeth for the entire upper row. So what we really want to do is we just want to make sure that we work out a general pencil sketch forming the tongue. As the tongue comes out of the mouth, we also want to understand that the tongue slightly widens, and this is because it's kind of flattening against the bottom of the mouth, and this gives it a bit more of an arching and widening structure. Now obviously the tongue is quite a malleable structure, and this means it can morph and change shape. So as it rests in the mouth, it tends to be quite thick and narrow, but it also has the ability to flatten out. What we want to do now is, once we have this general sketch, we're going to start working with a slightly darker pencil, and this is where we're going to start working in some shading into this drawing of the mouth and the tongue. A good suggestion is to start working around the teeth, and this is where we can start darkening the gaps that kind of demonstrate the inside of the mouth, so we can actually darken those areas to create more depth. And this is because as we darken the inside of the mouth, it's going to create more depth, bringing the teeth slightly more forward, as well as the tongue, creating more three-dimensionality within the drawing itself. Now when it comes to the tongue, the way in which we kind of define the shape of the tongue is with this very subtle shading. A good suggestion is to look at a few images of a tongue sticking out of a mouth, and what happens is the tongue has these subtle little curves and indentations and grooves, but because it is this muscular type of structure, it doesn't have any sharp edges. The way in which its curves are defined is by the way the light source interacts with the surface of the tongue, and this is where it starts to expose these very subtle details in the tongue, such as the dorsum of the tongue, as well as the median sulcus of the tongue, and so on and so on. And these little details, these little indentations, these bumps, these grooves, that center line that runs through the tongue, these are all very soft details, and the way in which we establish these details is not with distinct line work, but with really soft shading. Now obviously the tongue is basically broken up into two equal parts, and with the center having this indentation that runs down the middle of the tongue tends to have this curvature. The tongue also is quite thick, which means that we want to capture this quality, but the way in which we capture this quality again isn't with any sort of distinct line work, but it is about kind of understanding how the light interacts with the tongue itself to create these shadow wings that define the outlining of the thickness of the tongue. Now, something to bear in mind, the tongue is also generally moist, so what happens is light reflects off of that moist surface along the entire surface of the tongue, and this means that there's a lot of highlights within the tongue itself. So this is the way in which we kind of use these details or these features of highlights as well as shadow formation to strategically define the shape of the tongue, as well as the grooves, indentations, and all these little details like the taste buds. Now, we really want to make sure that we're working a lot of shading along the outer rim of the tongue, and this is where most of our shading work will be present in the drawing of the tongue. Now, the reason why we do this is obviously because the tongue is sticking out and is kind of flattened from this pose. It is quite exposed to light, which means there's going to be a lot of negative space or highlights present in the tongue. So when we shade in the tongue, we're not necessarily shading in the entire structure. What we're actually doing is we're going to use a lot of negative space, and we're going to use a lot of subtle shading to define the structure more along the edge of the tongue. So with our pencils, what we want to do is we want to actually shade along the edge of the tongue. As we come to the tip of the tongue, we're going to start working some shading through to the center of the tongue. We can work some shading directly up through or along the center, moving into the mouth, as well as moving along the sides of the tongue. Try to think of it also as working negative space along the edge of the tongue. So the idea is that we're going to work shading along the actual outline of the tongue, but then we're going to leave some negative space and then work shading again along the inner side of the tongue, or as in we're going to work in some shading that runs parallel with the outside of the tongue, leaving some space in between the outline and that shading that runs along the inside of the tongue. And this is going to leave that negative strip, that negative space strip along the outsides of the tongue to kind of bring more three-dimensionality, give more depth to the structure, kind of suggest more curvature in the structure as well. Then from the center point, running from the tip of the tongue all the way through to the teeth or inside the mouth, we can start to add in some more shading. Again, the intention here is to not color in the entire tongue, but to rather utilize our shading in a way that kind of emphasizes the curvature or the subtle curves within the tongue itself. We can obviously add more detail and shading to the surrounding features, and this is obviously going to give the tongue drawing overall a more detailed quality, giving it a more realistic quality. Again, a tongue is not a structure that exists in isolation. It needs to work in tandem or together with other features in order for it to make sense. So it is just as important to add more shading and more detail to the surrounding features as it is to kind of add detailing and shading to the tongue itself. So we just want to spend some time with our pencil, kind of work shading into both the tongue as well as the teeth, making sure that we are darkening the gaps or the spaces inside the mouth. We can also spend some time just adding some structure and texture to the lips itself. We also want to think about how the tongue or the teeth rest over the tongue, creating the subtle shadowing near the inside of the mouth, or where the teeth kind of go over the tongue. So these are the kinds of things we want to think about. It's really important to consider the light source and how it interacts with areas that are exposed and areas that have less exposure. So make sure you take your time with your pencil before we move on to adding in some darker detailing and shading with our pen. Okay, now once we are done with our pencil, we can start moving on to pen, and this is basically where we start to use our pencil shading drawing as a means of guiding us to just slightly darken the features that we have already drawn and shaded in. At this point, we should obviously have an already drawn image, pencil drawn image of a tongue, but now we're going to start obviously darkening these details as we basically have done with our pencil. We're going to follow the same process with our pen. Now, ballpoint pen is just the same as pencil. We want to treat it as the same shading process, the same drawing process, and this is where we slowly add layer over layer to slightly darken and give more contrast. Now, ballpoint pen works very similar to pencil in the sense that its ink comes out quite sparingly, so we don't necessarily need to make these really harsh, distinct lines. What we want to do is we want to softly shade over our pencil mark, slowly building up layers. Now, there are features in this drawing, obviously, that can be colored in quite dark, and this is the gaps in the mouth where obviously light will have less exposure. But as we come to details that are a little bit more precious, such as the teeth, the lips, the tongue itself, this is where we slowly want to build up our layers. So the idea here is to utilize your ballpoint pen similar to that as you would a pencil, working over the details in the teeth, slowly working over the shading that you have already done with your pencil. We really want to use our pencil shading as a means of guiding us. Now, obviously, the shadow formation that runs along the bottom of the teeth is going to be quite dark, and again, this is because teeth tend to hover over the tongue. The top row of teeth will hover slightly over the tongue, casting the shadow on the tongue itself. Another important thing to consider are gradients, and this is where there are these little subtle transitions from dark to light. The way shadows obviously work is when they are least exposed to light, they're going to be very dark, but as they become more exposed to the light source, they become less dark and obviously less harsh. And this is particularly true for shadows that form outside of the mouth or transition into the mouth or from the mouth. Now, we want to just take our time. This is a matter of patience. It's slowly a matter of just following our pencil shading marks and making sure that we don't rush this process. A good suggestion is also have some scrap piece of paper nearby. It's always good to scratch on a scrap piece of paper with your ballpoint pen, because this helps you kind of get rid of excess ink throughout the shading process. So again, some things to remember is the gaps on the side of the mouth, they can be very dark, but obviously as the shadows form along the teeth, they become quite light as the features become more exposed to a light source, and as the shadows form from below the teeth or underneath the teeth into the tongue, it will transition in a gradient that goes from dark to light. Now, as we work our shading into the tongue and we start defining those little subtle shifts in shape and form, those very soft curves within the tongue, again, we just want to make sure that we are utilizing our pencil marks to assist us as we shade with our pen. So a good suggestion is to again start working on the sides, and this is where we add shading along the outline of the tongue or along the sides of the tongue. The idea here is to not overpower the tongue with really dark marks. It is about kind of building up layer over layer. However, the outline of the tongue is going to be slightly darker in shading, and this is because, again, the light source obviously struggles to penetrate the sides of the tongue compared to that of the upper surface of the tongue, which is very exposed to the light source. We really don't want to overpower the tongue with our shading. We really want to keep our shading quite light with our pen. The idea is to just emphasize the already shaded in features that we have done with our pencil. What we can do is we can kind of darken some shading that forms along the tip of the tongue and starts to flow from the tip of the tongue into the center. And this is also where we can start being a little bit more playful with texture. So for instance, we can also start working in some stippling marks that runs along these shading features to define more of like a taste bud texture in the tongue. Again, obviously the tongue isn't necessarily this smooth structure. It does have texture, it does have grain, which is basically defined by these details such as the taste buds and so on. But otherwise, this process is simply a matter of taking your time. It is just important that we obviously build up our shadows with our shading in the tongue through soft layers as opposed to really dark and harsh marks. Again, a tongue is not a structure that exists in isolation. So it's important to pay attention to the surrounding features as much as it is to pay attention to the tongue itself. And this means we can kind of go back and forth between shading the tongue itself and the surrounding features such as the lips. We can start working in some textural detailing into the lips as well, and this is where we can start defining the texture of the lips with line work, with some shading marks to give it more of a realistic three-dimensional quality. But otherwise, that is it, guys. This is the general process to think through as we approach a tongue drawing. Some things to take away: consider the light source, consider the glassy nature on the surface of the tongue due to its moist composition. Consider how negative space is utilized to define shape and form, and how we can use shading to define the shadows in a more subtle way as opposed to a really harsh, overpowering way to define the three-dimensional structure of the tongue. But otherwise, I hope this was helpful. If it was, please like and subscribe. That really helps us. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.